The man sat alone at the corner table of a small, sunlit cafe, his expensive watch catching the afternoon light as he stared at a meal he hadn't touched. The food had gone slightly cold, the steam long disappeared, but he didn't notice. Around him, the city buzzed with its usual careless energy, strangers laughing over coffee, a couple sharing a pastry, a child tugging at her mother's sleeve pointing at pigeons on the pavement. But he sat inside a silence only he could feel, a silence that had followed him for years now, showing up in quiet moments like this one, when there was nothing left to achieve and nowhere urgent to be. Then she appeared at the edge of his table. A black woman, perhaps 30, her clothes simple but worn at the edges, her natural hair pulled back, her posture carrying a dignity that didn't match the exhaustion sitting behind her eyes. She wasn't hurried. She wasn't trembling. She stood there like someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times and had finally decided today was the day. She didn't extend a hand or lower her gaze in apology for existing. She simply looked at him, calm and direct, and said, "If you feed me, I'll tell you something you need to hear. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now telling us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're watching from. We love knowing who's here with us. Now, let's begin." The Korean man looked up slowly from the untouched plate, his sharp eyes narrowing, not with irritation exactly, but with something closer to recognition of a feeling he couldn't yet name. He had been approached before in public spaces like this, by investors wanting 5 minutes of his time, by journalists angling for a quote, by people who recognized his face from magazine covers and wanted something from the version of him they had read about. But this was entirely different. Her voice carried no desperation, no rehearsed pitch, no trembling undercurrent of need. It carried weight, the kind of weight that only comes from years of carrying something heavy and learning to hold it without complaint. He studied her face for a long moment, the stillness in her expression, the quiet certainty behind those tired eyes, and without fully understanding the impulse that moved through him, he pulled out the empty chair across the table and said simply, "Sit down." She hesitated for just a second, a pause so brief most people wouldn't have caught it. But he caught everything. It was a hesitation that told him kindness without condition was something her body had quietly learned not to trust anymore. Then she sat, slowly, carefully, with a quiet grace that somehow filled the entire table and changed the energy of the small space around them. A waiter appeared almost immediately, hovering nearby, glancing between the two of them with barely concealed curiosity. The man ordered a full meal for her without asking what she wanted, instinctively choosing warmth, something substantial. He said nothing further after that, just watched and waited. When the food arrived, the woman looked down at the plate with an expression he found difficult to read at first. It wasn't quite hunger, though hunger was certainly part of it. It was something older and more complicated than that. Something closer to grief and relief arriving in the same breath. Like seeing a place you once called home, after being away so long you weren't sure it still existed. "Eat," he said, and the softness in his own voice surprised him so much he almost looked around to see who had spoken. She ate without rushing, without the urgency of someone who hadn't had a meal in too long. Each bite was measured and present, deliberate in a way that made the act of eating feel almost ceremonial. Like someone choosing consciously to stay inside the moment rather than escape it. He noticed how she paused between bites sometimes, her eyes drifting briefly to somewhere far beyond the cafe walls, somewhere only she could see, before returning quietly to the table. He found himself completely unable to look away, not because she was a curiosity or a spectacle, but because something about her presence reminded him of a truth he hadn't felt in a very long time. A truth he had worked extremely hard to keep buried. When her plate was more than half empty and some color had returned to her face, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his expression patient but expectant. "The secret," he said quietly. "You made a promise." She set her fork down gently, the soft clink of it against the ceramic plate somehow louder than everything else around them. She folded her hands on the table, looked up at him, and held his gaze without flinching. Her eyes were deep and very still. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about you." The cafe seemed to rearrange itself around those words. The espresso machine in the background, the murmur of nearby conversations, the distant sound of traffic filtering in through the open door. All of it seemed to lower in volume, as if the world itself was leaning in. He shifted in his chair, adjusted the collar of his shirt, and crossed his arms loosely across his chest, composure intact, but something underneath it already beginning to move. "You don't know me," he replied, his tone calm, measured. "I know enough," she said, and the way she said it was what unsettled him most. Not aggressive, not presumptuous, just quiet, like a door he had spent years keeping locked, being gently opened from the other side by someone who had always known where the key was. He said nothing further. He waited, and she understood that his silence was not dismissal but permission. She took a slow breath and began, her voice low and steady, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume to fill a room or reach the deepest part of a person. "You built something remarkable," she said. "The kind of life that people point at from a distance and call a dream. The kind of success that makes strangers use your name in sentences about what is possible. You have more than most people will ever imagine having, and you earned it, truly earned it, through sacrifice and discipline and years of choosing the harder path." He said nothing. His jaw was set, his eyes were steady, but his fingers pressed slightly into the tablecloth. "But somewhere in all that building," she continued, her voice unhurried, "somewhere between the first success and the last milestone and every achievement stacked carefully between them, you left someone behind. Not carelessly, not without knowing. You left someone behind deliberately, quietly, convincingly telling yourself it was necessary." She paused for just a moment. "And that person did not need your empire. They did not need the title or the penthouse or the name in the headlines. They needed you. The version of you that existed before you decided that greatness was more important than presence." The sound of the city outside continued, as though the world had no idea what was unfolding at this small corner table. He exhaled slowly through his nose, his gaze dropping to the table for the first time, and in that brief downward glance, he looked simultaneously much younger and much older than his age. "You're speaking generally," he said, his voice still even. "You could be describing anyone." "I'm not describing anyone," she answered softly, and there was no edge in her words. Just a clean, quiet certainty that cut straight through his deflection. She leaned forward slightly, her elbows resting on the table now, closing just a little of the distance between them. "There was a time," she said, "when you were softer than this, when you laughed without calculating the room first, when you made plans that had nothing to do with profit or positioning, when you stayed up through the night, not to close a deal or prepare a presentation, but simply because someone you loved needed you close and that felt like enough, more than enough." He was very still now. "You began to trade that slowly," she continued. "So gradually you probably didn't notice it happening in real time. One late meeting that ran into an evening you had promised to someone. One missed anniversary quietly rescheduled and then never rescheduled at all. One phone call you told yourself you'd return in the morning, then forgot about entirely by morning. And the person on the other end of all those missed moments didn't shout, didn't demand, just waited, adjusted. Made themselves smaller so your dreams could have more space." His throat moved. He swallowed once, slowly, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on the edge of the table. "One season became two," she said, her voice dropping even lower now. "Two became several. And by the time the silence between you was large enough to live in, you had already told yourself a story about how it was for the best, how they would understand someday, how the life you were building would eventually explain everything." He opened his mouth slightly, closed it. His eyes, which had spent years being the sharpest thing in every room he entered, looked uncertain now, raw around the edges. "That person believed in you," she said, and her voice caught just barely on the words, a tiny fracture quickly steadied. "Not because of what you were becoming, but because of exactly who you already were. Before the money, before the reputation, before any of it. They chose you when choosing you wasn't convenient or impressive or safe. They chose you when you were just a man with a vision and no guarantee." Something moved across his face then, fast and unguarded, like a shadow passing over still water. He looked away from her briefly, scanning the café with eyes that weren't actually seeing anything in front of them. He was somewhere else entirely. A different room. A different year. A voice he used to know better than his own. "How do you know any of this?" he asked, and the question came out quietly, stripped of all the authority he usually wore so effortlessly. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine and slightly desperate need to understand. She held his gaze across the table, and something in the way she looked at him shifted then. It was subtle, but he felt it immediately, a change in the air between them, like a song suddenly recognizable in its final bars after playing in the background for too long. "You really don't know who I am," she said slowly. It wasn't a question. The words landed differently than anything else she had said, because they weren't an accusation. They were something closer to a wound quietly reopened. He felt the hair rise on his arms beneath his shirt, felt something primal and instinctive begin to move through his chest, the body remembering before the mind is ready to admit what it knows. He looked at her again, this time differently. Not analyzing, not assessing, searching, going back through corridors of memory he had spent years sealing off with the brick and mortar of productivity and forward motion. He looked at the shape of her face, the particular stillness of her hands, the way she tilted her chin just slightly when she was waiting for something important. And then slowly, like a photograph developing in real time, the past began to appear. "No," he whispered, the word escaping him before he had given it permission. His voice was barely there. "It can't be." She didn't confirm it with words right away. She just looked at him with the full weight of someone who had been invisible to him for far too long, and let the truth arrive at its own pace. "I was there," she said finally, her voice soft but unwavering, "when you were nobody in particular. When you shared a tiny apartment with 2 other people and ate the same meal 4 nights in a row because it was what the budget allowed. When you carried your laptop to the café down the street because the Wi-Fi was better and you needed to finish a proposal that might change everything. I was the one sitting across from you at that table, drinking bad coffee and telling you it was going to work. Telling you that I believed it when you weren't sure you believed it yourself." He couldn't speak. His mouth was open slightly, and his eyes were doing something they almost never did, filling slowly against his will. "I was the one," she continued, her voice trembling now at the edges, "who ironed your shirt before your first real pitch meeting because your hands were shaking too much to do it yourself. Who stayed on the phone with you for 2 hours after you got the rejection that almost broke you, not saying much, just staying, just being there inside the silence with you so you wouldn't have to be alone in it." He pressed his hand flat against the table, steadying himself. "And when things began to change," she said, "when the meetings got longer and the calls got shorter and your eyes started looking through me instead of at me, I told myself it was a season. I told myself that people who love each other find their way back. I told myself to be patient because what you were building was important and love is supposed to be strong enough to survive distance." She paused, her jaw tightening briefly. "I believed that for a very long time." "I thought I had more time," he said, and his voice broke on the last word in a way that seemed to shock even him. He pressed his lips together, composing himself with visible effort, but the composure that returned was thinner now, like paper holding the shape of something that had already been torn. "Everyone thinks they have more time," she said gently, without cruelty, without any pleasure in his pain. "That is the one lie we all tell ourselves with complete conviction, that tomorrow is guaranteed, that the people who love us will always be there when we finally decide to turn around." He lowered his head, his shoulders no longer carrying the straight, confident line of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. They carried something heavier and more honest than power. They carried regret. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles into the bones quietly and stays. "I made choices," he said, his voice barely above a breath. "I told myself each one was necessary, each one was temporary, each one was leading somewhere that would eventually make sense of everything I was giving up." "I know," she said simply. "I watched you make them." He raised his eyes to hers then, and what passed between them in that moment was not romantic, not angry, not asking for anything at all. It was the particular recognition of 2 people who once shared something true and irreplaceable, meeting on the other side of a loss that neither of them had ever fully named out loud until now. "Did you ever stop waiting?" he asked, and the vulnerability in the question was so complete and so unfamiliar coming from him that it seemed to change the very light around the table. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands, then back at him. "I stopped waiting," she said carefully, "when I understood that waiting was keeping me from living, not because I stopped caring, but because I finally accepted that you had made your choice, and I had to respect it even when it hurt me deeply, even when I didn't understand it. I had to choose myself the way you had chosen everything else." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, she was still there, real and present and 30 years old, and somehow carrying the entire weight of a decade of silence with a grace that made him feel both grateful and ashamed. "I lost everything that mattered," he said quietly, not to her exactly, but to the version of himself that had made every one of those choices with such certainty, such unwavering confidence that success was the destination and love was just something that would wait patiently by the door. She stood slowly from the chair, pulling her jacket around her with unhurried hands, and he could see in her movements someone who had already done the long and painful work of healing. Someone who had come here today, not out of bitterness, and not to reclaim anything, but maybe simply to close something that had been left open too long, in both of them. For one final moment, their eyes met across the small table, across the empty plates and the cold coffee, and the years of silence piled up between them like furniture in a room no one had entered in too long. Two people, one shared history, a present that offered no revision and no return. She gave him a small nod, quiet and complete, and then she turned and walked away through the café, past the other tables, past the strangers who had no idea what had just happened at that corner seat, and out through the door into the bright afternoon. He sat there long after she disappeared, the city moving around him exactly as it always had, indifferent and continuous, knowing nothing of what had just unfolded at this small table in the middle of an ordinary Thursday. His food was cold, his coffee untouched, his watch still catching the light. And somewhere inside his chest, in a place that all his success and all his discipline had never managed to fully reach, something had broken open quietly, and for the first time in longer than he could honestly remember, he felt it. Because that is the truth no one tells you when you are young and hungry and certain that greatness is the point. The truth that only arrives later, in quiet cafes, across empty plates, in the eyes of someone who once loved you completely and learned to survive without you. The most expensive thing you will ever lose has no price attached to it. It cannot be recovered in a quarterly report or a record-breaking deal. It lives in moments you chose not to show up for. In people you let go of so slowly you convinced yourself it wasn't a choice at all. And all the success in the world cannot buy back a single one of them. This story is over, but what it leaves behind is yours to sit with. If it reached something in you today, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe so you never miss the next story, and come back, because the journeys we take here are far from finished.